Hello, my friends. If you're watching this video, you probably love paranormal stories. But what I'm about to tell you is not fiction. At least I wish it were. I wish it were just a story I made up. But it's not. My name is Emre. I am 29 years old. I'm going to tell you about an event that happened to me about 3 years ago. Before this incident, I wasn't someone who believed in paranormal things. In fact, when such topics came up among friends, I was usually the one making fun of them. My life was going quite normally. After graduating from university, I started working for a small software company in Ankara. My salary wasn't bad, but rent prices in the city had increased so much that finding a decent apartment had become almost impossible. For a long time, I had to rent just a room. At that time, the only thing I wanted was to live alone in my own place, even if it was small. One day, while returning home from work, I was looking at listings on my phone. Most of the apartments were either too expensive or too far from the city center. Just as I was about to lose hope, I saw an ad. It was quite close to the center. The building wasn't new, but according to the photos, it looked perfectly livable. The strangest part was the price. It was nearly half the price of other apartments on the market. At first, I thought it was a scam, but I decided to call anyway. An elderly man answered the phone. His voice was quite slow, and it felt as if he was choosing his words carefully as he spoke. I told him I wanted to see the apartment. The man fell silent for a short while, as if he hadn't expected this. Then he gave me the address and said I could come by the next day in the late afternoon. The next day after work, I went to the address he gave me. The building was in one of the old neighborhoods of the city. The street was quite quiet. There were modern buildings nearby, but this building looked quite old compared to them. It was about 7 stories high. The paint on the exterior had started to peel, and some of the balcony railings were rusted. But still, it didn't look completely abandoned. Lights were on in some of the windows. The elderly man I had spoken to on the phone the day before was waiting for me in front of the door. He said his name was Kemal. He was the building manager. He had an old keychain in his hand with dozens of keys jingling on it. The first thing I noticed when we entered the stairwell was a strange silence. In old buildings, you usually hear the sound of televisions, conversations, or music coming from somewhere. But here, there was almost no sound at all. Only our footsteps echoed. Mr. Kemal showed me the elevator. It was quite old, the kind with metal doors and an interior lit by yellowing fluorescent lamps. "4th floor," he said. We got into the elevator. The door closed and the elevator began to rise slowly. Just as we reached the level of the 3rd floor, something strange happened. The elevator jolted for a moment. Then it stopped briefly, as if it had caught on something. Mr. Kemal immediately looked at the buttons. "Old building, you know," he said with a laugh. "It does that sometimes." Then the elevator moved again. But during that brief pause, I noticed something. While looking at the elevator buttons, I saw that the button for the 7th floor had been scratched out. It was as if someone had specifically gouged that button so it wouldn't be used. I thought about asking about it, but I didn't care much at that moment. We went up to the 4th floor. The apartment was better than I expected. It was small but clean. The living room window looked out onto the street. The kitchen was narrow but functional. The bedroom was large enough for one person. Honestly, it looked quite good for the price. Mr. Kemal handed me the key. "You can take it right away if you want," he said. I was surprised by how fast this was moving. "Aren't there other people who want to see it?" I asked. The old man paused for a moment, then he shook his head. "No," he said, "most people don't want it because it's an old building." That answer seemed a bit strange to me, but I accepted it anyway. I decided to move in that evening. Moving didn't take long because I didn't have many belongings anyway. At around 11 o'clock at night, I was spending my first night in my new home. Everything was quite normal. Until I woke up at 02:17 a.m. What woke me up was a sound. At first, I couldn't quite understand what it was. I sat up in bed and started to listen. There was silence. Just as I was trying to go back to sleep, I heard the sound again. This time it was clearer, heavy footsteps coming from above. It was the sound of someone walking very slowly. But at that moment, something occurred to me. I lived on the 4th floor, so there should have been only 2 floors above me, the 6th floor, and the 7th floor button I saw in the elevator. But that button was scratched out, meaning it wasn't in use. In that moment, I tried to find a logical explanation for myself. It was probably one of the neighbors upstairs. But still, a strange unease had settled inside me. Because that sound, it didn't sound like a normal walk. It was as if someone was walking with very heavy steps, making the floorboards creak as they stepped. And the strangest part, this sound was coming from directly above my bed. I mean, it felt as if someone wasn't on the 5th floor but walking right on top of me. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, but I didn't know yet. That sound was only the beginning of the most terrifying days of my life. I couldn't sleep properly until morning that night. But back then, I was still trying to convince myself that this was something normal. After all, it was an old building. In old buildings, pipes make noise, floorboards creak, and neighbors might stay up late. These were all logical explanations. At least, that's what I wanted to think. When the alarm went off around 7 in the morning, I was already half awake. I got ready and went to work. I was a bit tired throughout the day, but I didn't dwell too much on what had happened during the night. Until I returned home that evening. I entered the building around 8 o'clock. The stairwell was just as silent as before. Strangely, people were almost never seen in this building. I never ran into anyone on the stairs, and no sounds of doors opening or closing could be heard. I got into the elevator. I pressed the button. The elevator began to rise slowly. Just as it reached the level of the 3rd floor, that same thing happened again. The elevator jolted briefly. Then it stopped for a second. At that moment, I noticed what I had seen yesterday once more. On the button panel, the button for the 7th floor was indeed gouged out. It looked as if it had been scratched over, and the plastic part was slightly broken. But this time, I noticed something else. That little red light inside the button, it seemed to be flickering. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then, the light suddenly went out. The elevator moved again and went up to the 4th floor. A strange unease formed inside me then, but I still didn't think too much of it. I went inside, ordered some food, and sat down at my computer. As it approached midnight, I fell asleep while watching television. Suddenly, I woke up to a sharp metallic sound. At first, I didn't understand where it was coming from. Then I heard it again. The sound of the elevator. It was as if someone was forcing the elevator door shut. It was 02:11 a.m. Why would someone be using the elevator so late? Driven by curiosity, I opened my door. I stepped out into the hallway. I walked toward the stairwell. The elevator door was open, but there was no one inside. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw the panel inside the elevator. One of the buttons was lit up, the 7th floor. My heart nearly stopped for a second, but this was impossible, because that button was broken. It had even been scratched out so it wouldn't be used. I stood there for a few seconds. Then the elevator closed on its own and began to move upward. I was completely frozen. The sound of the elevator ascending echoed through the stairwell. 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, it passed the 4th floor, 5th floor, 6th floor. And then it stopped. But no sound of a door came from the upper floors. No footsteps, no talking, nothing. It was as if the elevator had gone to an empty floor. I waited a bit longer. When nothing happened, I went back to my apartment. But it was very hard to fall back asleep that night. The next day, I left work early. This was the only thing on my mind. I decided to find the building manager, Mr. Kemmel, and ask him about it. I found him in his small room at the entrance. I knocked on the door. He smiled when he saw me. "Are you happy with the house?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, but then I went straight to the point. "I want to ask something," I said. "Is there a seventh floor in this building?" The expression on Mr. Kemmel's face changed instantly. His smile slowly vanished. He looked at me for a few seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair. "The seventh floor is not in use," he said. "Why?" I asked. He remained silent for a long time before answering. Then he said something very brief. "An old matter." This answer didn't satisfy me. "The elevator went up there last night," I said. Mr. Kemmel's eyes widened for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "It might be broken," he said, but his voice wasn't very convincing. Just then the building door opened. A middle-aged woman walked in. She had grocery bags in her hands. When she saw me, she paused for a short moment. Then she looked at Mr. Kemmel. "The new tenant?" she asked. Mr. Kemmel nodded. The woman approached me. There was a strange expression on her face. It was as if she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then she leaned in slowly and said something very quietly. "After 3 in the morning, she paused for a moment. Then she whispered, "Don't listen to the sounds coming from above." After saying this, she headed for the stairs without another word. I just stood there, stunned. My heart started beating a little faster. Mr. Kemmel looked annoyed. "Neighbors exaggerate sometimes," he said. But this time, his words gave me no confidence at all. As I went back to my apartment that night, I had a bad feeling. It felt like everyone in this building knew something, but no one was saying it. Nothing happened until 2 in the morning. Just as I was about to sleep, I heard that sound again, footsteps coming from the floor above. But this time it was different. It wasn't just walking. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy, slowly. The sound of something scraping across the wooden floor. Then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A very thin voice coming from the upper floor, a child's voice. Very faintly, it was saying a single sentence. "Come downstairs." I was completely frozen at that moment. Because that voice, it was coming from directly above my bedroom. But above me, officially, no one lived there. And at that moment I realized. The footsteps, slowly, were coming right toward the point where I was standing. It's truly difficult to describe in words what I felt at that moment. Because when I heard that voice, the feeling that rose inside me wasn't just fear. It was more like the sensation that something wrong was very close to me. I was frozen in my bed. The footsteps on the floor above were progressing slowly. It sounded as if someone was walking heavily. But the rhythm of the steps wasn't normal. When a human walks, the steps come at equal intervals. But this sound, one step, a long silence, then another step, then a dragging sound. It was as if someone was struggling to walk. Right then, I heard that voice again. The child's voice. This time it was a bit clearer. In a very thin and strange tone, it said, "I'm here." My heart was beating so fast I felt like I could hear its sound from the outside. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a family on the floor above. Maybe they had a child. Maybe the child had woken up during the night. But another voice inside me was telling me this wasn't true, because that voice didn't sound like a child's normal speaking voice. It felt as if it were coming from a very distant place. I couldn't sleep until morning that night. When morning came, my first task was to go to the upper floors. I walked up the stairs. I reached the 5th floor. All the doors were closed. There wasn't a single sound. I went up to the 6th floor. It was the same. As I was climbing the stairs, I looked up. There was one more floor, but at the end of the stairs there was an iron door. The door was locked with chains. There was an old warning sign on it. The sign read, "No entry." This was likely the entrance to the 7th floor. I approached the door. No sound came from behind it, but a very cold draft was coming through the gap beneath the door. I stared at the door for a while. Then I decided to head back down. But as I was descending the stairs, I noticed something. A woman was watching me from behind one of the doors on the 6th floor. The door was slightly ajar. It was the woman with the grocery bags I had seen yesterday. She was looking at me. There was a strange expression in her eyes. It was as if she were worried. I went down the stairs and stopped in front of her door. I knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. The woman looked at me. "Did you go up to the 7th floor?" she asked. Her voice was very serious. I nodded. "The door is locked," I said. The woman took a deep breath. Then she invited me inside. Her home was old but clean. We went into the kitchen. She poured me a tea. Then she sat in a chair. She remained silent for a while. Then she began to speak. "I've lived in this building for a long time," she said. "About 12 years." She bowed her head slightly. "The 7th floor used to be occupied. A family lived there." She paused for a moment. Then she continued. "A mother, a father, and a little girl. Her name was Elif." As she said this, her eyes were fixed on the floor. "One night," she said, "something terrible happened in the building." My heart started beating a bit faster. "What happened?" I asked. The woman spoke slowly. "The father lost his mind. No one knows exactly why. Rumor has it he had lost his job. Some said it was something else, something paranormal." She paused. Then she continued. "That night we heard screaming, the woman's screams. Then suddenly everything went silent. A bad feeling formed inside me. And then?" I asked. The woman raised her eyes to me. "The police came in the morning. They broke down the door. The mother and father," her voice trembled, "were dead." My throat had gone dry. "And the girl?" I asked. The woman waited a few seconds before answering. Then she said very slowly, "They couldn't find her." Something cold passed through me at that moment. "What do you mean, they couldn't find her?" The woman shook her head. "She wasn't in the house. The police searched everywhere. They searched the building. They searched the roof. But the girl was nowhere to be found." The kitchen became very quiet. Then the woman looked at me. "A week later, people started hearing sounds at night." My heart accelerated again. "What kind of sounds?" The woman answered very slowly. "Footsteps coming from above, and sometimes," she paused, then whispered, "a child's voice." My throat was completely parched. What was it saying? The woman looked at me. Her face was pale. Then she repeated the same sentence. "Come downstairs." At that moment, I felt as if my heart was going to jump out of my chest, because I had heard that sentence too. The woman took a deep breath. Then the managers closed off the 7th floor. They chained the door. They didn't allow anyone to go up. Just then, something occurred to me. "The elevator went to the 7th floor last night," I said. The woman froze instantly. "What did you say?" "The elevator, it was empty, but the button was lit up." The color completely drained from the woman's face. She said nothing for a while. Then she spoke very slowly. "That is not a good thing." "Why?" I asked. The woman looked at me. Her eyes were filled with terror. "Because that usually happens when someone is being called upstairs." My stomach knotted. "What do you mean called upstairs?" The woman didn't answer, but right at that moment, from above, a very heavy sound came. It sounded as if something had fallen hard onto the floor. The woman and I both looked at the ceiling at the same time. Then a sound that made both our blood run cold was heard. From the floor above, slowly, something was being dragged toward the stairs, toward the place where the metal door was. And a few seconds later, the sound of chains echoing in the stairwell was heard, as if someone was trying to open the locked door on the 7th floor. What my neighbor on the 6th floor told me was already disturbing enough, but the truly terrifying part was that sound of chains coming from above, right in the middle of our conversation. For a few seconds we both froze, staring at the ceiling. There was a locked door in front of the stairs leading to the 7th floor. It was bound with chains. In other words, it was impossible for anyone to pass through. But that sound, it was definitely coming from above. The woman stood up slowly. Her face had gone deathly pale. "You heard that, didn't you?" she said. I nodded. My heart was pounding like crazy. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then the woman said in a very quiet voice, "Sometimes that door moves on its own." A shiver ran through me when I heard that sentence. "What do you mean on its own?" I asked. She didn't answer. She only shook her head from side to side. "It's better not to meddle with certain things in this building." After saying this, she pointed toward her door. "You've heard enough for today, go home." But I was starting to get curious now, because one thing was clear. Everyone in this building knew something, but no one was telling the whole story. I left the woman's apartment. I headed for the stairs. I looked up. Above the 6th floor sat that iron door. It was still closed, but the sound of the chains I had just heard was still echoing in my mind. I thought for a few seconds. Then I started climbing the stairs. With every step, the tension inside me increased. I passed the 6th floor and came to the front of the door. The iron door was quite old. The chain on it looked rusted. But the truly strange thing was, the chain wasn't sitting completely locked. It looked as if someone had just pulled on it moments ago. My heart quickened even more. I approached the door. I touched the chain. The metal was cold, but the chain wasn't entirely still. It was swaying slightly, as if it really had moved just a few minutes ago. A logical thought occurred to me. Maybe the building manager had come up here this morning. Maybe he had checked the door. But then I noticed something else. The lock on the chain wasn't fully closed. Anyone who wanted to could open the door. I stared at the door for a while. Then curiosity outweighed my fear. I slowly lifted the chain. The sound of metal scraping echoed through the stairwell. I pushed the door. The door opened with a heavy creak. Before me lay a dark corridor. This was definitely the 7th floor, but it looked nothing like the other floors. Most of the ceiling lights were broken. The hallway was pitch black. The paint on the walls was peeling. There was dust on the floor. It looked as if no one had set foot here for years. I stood at the entrance for a moment. Then I turned on my phone's flashlight. I stepped inside slowly. The dust crunched beneath my shoes. There were 3 doors in the hallway. The first door was closed. The second door was also closed, but the door at the very end was ajar. It was slightly open, and a very faint sound of wind was coming from inside. My heart raced again. I walked slowly toward that door. I reached it and placed my hand on the surface. I pushed it open a bit further. Inside was an old living room. Most of the furniture was gone, but some things remained. An old table, a broken chair, and toys scattered across the floor. I shone my light on the toys. A doll, a small car, a plush bear. A very strange feeling washed over me because these looked like they belonged to a child. Probably the toys of that missing girl, Elif's. Then I noticed something on the floor. There were marks in the dust, footprints, but they didn't belong to an adult. They were small footprints, a child's footprints. My throat went dry. The prints were so clear. It looked as if someone had walked there very recently. I followed the prints with my light. They led out of the hallway and into the room. Then, at one point, they suddenly vanished. I was staring at that exact spot when I heard a sound behind me, a very light whisper, a child's voice. It came from right behind my ear, and it said very clearly, "You've finally come." At that moment, my body froze completely. I turned around slowly. The hallway was empty. There was no one there, but then something else happened. The door to the room slowly closed on its own, and that child's voice from within the corridor spoke again. This time, it was a bit closer. "Now I am not alone." The moment I heard that whisper, all sense of logic within me completely vanished. The door had closed behind me. The corridor was dark, And that child's voice, which had just come from right behind my ear, was now echoing inside the room. Now I am not alone. When I heard that sentence, I felt as if my heart was going to burst out of my chest. I gripped my phone tighter. I swung the flashlight beam toward the center of the room, but there was no one there. I slowly began to back away toward the door. I tried to pull it open, but the door didn't budge. It felt as if someone was holding it from the outside. I tried once more. Still, it wouldn't open. At that moment, I heard a small footstep behind me. I turned around slowly. I shone my phone's light on the floor. What I saw then was a sight I will never forget for as long as I live. On the dusty floor, new footprints were forming, but no one was visible. The footprints were appearing one by one, as if an invisible person were walking. One step, then another step. The tracks were coming right toward me. In that instant, my legs locked completely. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The footprints stopped right in front of me. Then a very thin sound of breathing came through the air, right in front of my face. And the child's voice spoke again. This time it was much clearer. "You found me." My throat was completely parched. Who are you?" I whispered. There were a few seconds of silence. Then something moved in the corner of the room. I turned my light in that direction. There was a small table there. On the table sat an old photo frame. I brought the light closer. There was a family in the photo, a mother, a father, and a little girl. The girl looked to be about 6 or 7 years old. She had long black hair. At the bottom of the photo, there was a small inscription. Elif 2010. Right then I heard something running behind me. I spun around quickly, but again, no one was there. Only new footprints had formed in the dust on the other side of the room. This time, the tracks had moved very fast. My heart was beating frantically. I lunged for the door again. This time, I pulled the door with all my strength. It flew open suddenly. I nearly fell to the floor. I scrambled out into the corridor immediately. But just as I was exiting the doorway, the child's voice spoke again. This time, there was a very sad tone to it. "Don't go." I stopped for a moment. I still don't know why I did it, but I turned back. "What do you want?" I asked. At that moment, something appeared at the end of the hallway. At first, it was very faint, like a shadow in the air. But within a few seconds, it began to take shape. The silhouette of a little girl, about 6 years old. She had long hair. I couldn't quite make out her face, but her eyes were looking at me. My throat tightened. "Are you Elif?" I asked. The girl nodded her head very slightly. In that moment, alongside my fear, another emotion emerged: sadness, because that small silhouette looked much more lonely than she did frightening. Then she spoke very slowly. "My father." She paused for a moment, then she whispered, "My father is still here." Something cold crawled through my insides. "What do you mean he's here?" I said. Before answering, the girl looked into the darkness of the corridor. Then she turned back to me. "You must go." My heart raced. "Why?" The girl's voice trembled. "Because." Right then, a very heavy footstep came from the other end of the corridor. But this sound didn't belong to a child. This was the footstep of an adult, very heavy, very slow, and with every step the floor groaned. The girl's silhouette suddenly recoiled. There was terror on her face. Then she looked at me one last time and whispered, "You're too late." At that exact moment, a long shadow moved in the darkness of the hallway. And from within that darkness, a very muffled, deep male voice spoke. "So you found her." In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone on the 7th floor, and the thing Elif was afraid of was still in this building. "The father has arrived." I leaned against the door, my breath catching in my throat. A heavy footstep echoed from within the darkness of the corridor. The silhouette shrank, then vanished for a moment. But that muffled voice still reverberated. "So you found her." Everything inside me turned to panic. My hand trembling, I gripped my phone's flashlight tightly. But the light fell into nothingness where the shadow had taken shape. There was only a black void in that darkness. Little Elif's silhouette was still before me, but this time her face was visible, full of fear and pain. She looked at me silently. "My father," she said, her voice shaking. And in that moment I understood. This wasn't just a child's spirit. Behind her was a heavy, invisible presence. The air was so cold my breath was freezing. A deep hum filled my ears, as if all the walls of the building were screaming. I tried to take a step, but it felt as if my feet were glued to the floor. Another dark shape appeared behind the door. It had no eyes, its face was pale and deformed. With every breath it took, the metal doors vibrated. Elif looked at me, her eyes welling up. "Run." But there was no time to run. The dark figure was advancing, silent, yet shaking everything with its influence. The air on the 7th floor was heavy and suffocating, yet strangely magnetic. A voice inside me said, "You cannot leave this place." I realized then, the spirit of Elif's father was in this building. The pain of having lost his daughter was keeping him bound to this world. As that dark shape moved toward me, a single idea came to mind: to walk quickly toward the door without making eye contact. I quickened my pace, but the corridor seemed to stretch. With every step, the shadow followed me, yet it couldn't quite touch me. Elif's silhouette appeared before me, guiding my way. "To the right," she said, her voice a whisper but clear. I noticed an exit stairwell in the corridor. The stairs looked rusty and old but sturdy. I headed there immediately. The shadow accelerated, the humming filling my ears. But somehow, Elif's presence emboldened me. I raced down the stairs, the floorboards groaning with every step. It felt as if the 7th floor itself didn't want to let me go. But finally, I reached the building's entrance door. I threw it open, and the cold air hit my face. I looked back. The darkness of the 7th floor still stretched over the top of the stairs, but a sense of relief washed over me. Elif's silhouette looked at me one last time and smiled. Then, she vanished. After leaving the house, I immediately called the police. All records regarding the 7th floor were missing. Mr. Kemmel and the neighbors told me that this floor was officially closed, but I knew something was there. That day, I found an old news report in the archives. In 2010, a family had died tragically in this building. The child, Elif, had disappeared and was never found. The father had committed suicide, but according to rumors, a very dark power had taken the family under its influence before their deaths. That's when everything clicked into place. The events in the building, the footsteps, the child's voice, they were all echoes of this tragedy. A paranormal bond, the spirits were still there. But now I knew. Elif's spirit was innocent, while her father's was wrathful, and these two continued to exist as energies that could not leave the building. I never spent another night in that building. I moved out immediately, but the story of the building and Elif's voice are still in my mind. Sometimes I think people forget the traces of the tragedies that occurred, but places do not forget, and some spirits still wait there. Maybe Elif protected me. Maybe her father's rage still wanders the darkness of that floor. But there was one thing I learned. No matter how dark the past is, it creates a bond for the spirits left behind. And sometimes, only an innocent guide can show you the way. After that day, my perspective on paranormal events changed completely. Now I believe, even if people cannot see them, some things exist. And sometimes you have no choice but to face them.